the lab. My name is Anicia Street. I am an assistant professor at LSU in the School of Architecture, College of Art and Design. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us where you're situated, be it in the Caribbean or another part of the world. I am very excited to just have the privilege to do this with my colleagues, Irene and Fabio. I grew up in the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I hail from the capital city of Port of Spain, or Puerta de España. I was born and bred and nurtured in the hills of Laventille, a French village where my interest and passion for architecture began. My academic and professional journey is an exciting hybrid, as I like to refer to it. It is multidisciplinary in architecture, civil and structural engineering, construction. Those were my fields of study and practice. And this background, has afforded me the opportunity to research, teach, and practice in all three. My research situates itself in domain studies of Afrofuturism. I focus on heritage preservation and building technology practices within African diasporic communities throughout the US, Southern US primarily, the Caribbean and Latin America. I seek to engage in formal as well as informal design processes that promote innovative, sustainable, and equitable built environments of the future. Additionally, I have an insatiable passion for dance and fashion and have professionally instructed in both, and I've come to embrace the intersection of all my interests. I co-direct the Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab with my colleagues from the School of Architecture, Professor Fabio Capra Ribeiro and Professor Irene Brisson. We are joined in this initiative by an interdisciplinary group of LSU faculty, and we invite anyone from LSU or other institutions interested in joining us to please reach out. And you can learn more about our plans at our website, and I'll paste that in the chat if it's not already pasted in a bit here. So when we think about the Caribbean, we understand the Caribbean as a broad region. It's an archipelagic concept that coincides with other frames like the Black Atlantic or Plantation America, including Louisiana and the Gulf Coast and coastal regions of Central and Southern America. The Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab was founded as a transdisciplinary collaborative center for research and design concerning the constructed environments of the Caribbean. We are supported by an LSU Provost Big Ideas Seed Grant. And I like what this is a note here from Professor Brisson. We think it's truly a big idea. I just love that line. The LSU School of Architecture, and of course, our broad networks of friends, family, and colleagues. We hope to create a transdisciplinary network of scholars, professionals, and organizations focused on environments and communities of the Greater Caribbean. We launched the lab with the Caribbean Futures Workshop in February of 2023, where we gathered scholars and practitioners from Haiti, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Uruguay, and the United States at LSU to work with students to learn and envision potential futures in the context of accelerating climate change in sites across the Caribbean. Please feel free to visit our website where you can see the outcomes of this workshop and other content that we are engaging in with the lab. All right, so in this particular series, this colloquium series, we're hosting this online because we wish to encourage an interdisciplinary and international and multilingual conversation about spatial justice in the Caribbean. Above all, This is intended to be a series of introductions and the beginning of a dialogue that we hope will last years. Resisting a legacy of isolation, reinforced by imperial and potential barriers to free movement in the Caribbean, we think it is critical that we cross boundaries to speak to each other and understand the challenges and strengths of the Caribbean from our many perspectives. Only then can we begin to generate innovative ideas and practical solutions for a just future in the Caribbean and globally. And I'd like to add this by saying the true Caribbean people are carnival people, as I like to refer to it. We are vibrant. We're not dead people. We like to be heard and we like to have fun. This was a quote from Liv Richards, well-known Antiguan cricketer from the West Indies cricket team. And so by this should not be a quiet event at all. If we were in person, we would expect laughter, sighs, songs of agreement. Unfortunately, we do need you to stay muted, but we invite you to continue using the chat. You can call out some key phrases, post questions, your thoughts. You can respond to each other, share references, citations, anything that you feel can contribute to this conversation as you move to do so. And then we'll prepare, we'll have a question and answer session in which you can share even more broad. So we will begin the core part of our presentation here with Dame Hines from Hines Architecture, and then it'll follow by our respondent, Stefan from the Universidad Central de Venezuela and Incursiones. So we will have time, approximately 10 to 15 minutes for discussion at the end. When we get to this point, I'd like everyone to raise your hands using the Zoom, the raise hand Zoom emoji, or you can put your questions in the chat and we'll be sure to monitor those. So with that, I'll introduce our main speaker. Daimian S. Hines is a member of AIA and NOMA. He's a fellow NOMA family member. He's a visionary design architect and an emerging critical voice in the design community who undertakes projects and pursuits that enhance communities and cultures. Daimian founded Hines Architecture and Design after returning to Houston from practice in Southeast Asia. From its inception, he endeavored to challenge the form and focus of a traditional minority firm by envisioning and building a mission-driven global practice. As founding principal, Daimian offers exceptional leadership and expertise. He is known for innovation, meticulous approach to and dedication to client-focused outcomes. Daimian has more than 2 decades of experience delivering large-scale projects across the globe. His expertise and career include conceptualization, planning services, master planning, feasibility assessment, design, and project delivery. He is a member of the American Institute of Architects and was previously accredited by the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And I'd like to say that Daimian serves on several notable boards. If I could list every one of them out, I would right now, but he's very involved in volunteer and community service. And I am just really honored to have him present his work for us today. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Daimian, and then after Daimian's presentation is concluded, I will introduce Stefan, and we'll move on with the rest of the session. All right, Daimian, it's all yours.
Wow, thank you guys. Thanks, Anicia, Fabio, Irene, and I see a handful of my team members on the call, and whoever wrote that bio on my team side, I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to launch into the presentation. And so let me, I guess, tee it up. Did not know what project to present. I think one thing I do appreciate with this session and this focus is, the connection between architecture, and it has an emotional component, diaspora, and what I've been fortunate to be a part of is the built environment and the work across the globe that's happening relative to spatial justice. And so there were a couple projects we had that we could have presented, but the one that I think everyone knows us for, that's the one I just want to tee up. And I'm going to turn my timer on. I believe we have a little less than 20 minutes. I'm going to try to just run through these slides. If there's something of note in the chat, Anicia, Irene, Fabio, just let me know. And I'll try to even keep pace on my end here. So with that, I will launch into the chat. Is there anything I need to cover before I launch into the chat?
Nope, you're all good.
All right, here we
Good
go.
to go.
Where is it? There it is. Share. Oh, no. Oh, there we go. So, the buckets, and we'll see how disciplined I am relative to the buckets, but want to do a brief intro of kind of my interests and myself, and specifically relative to presentation work that I think captures this idea of architecture of emotions, exploration of influences of emotions, spatial justice, equity, the importance and challenges of diasporic communities. Over since 2019, this project, which is the new Houses of Parliament for the government of Jamaica, and National Heroes Park, which is a 52-acre park that the building will sit in. We've gone through a variety of emotions and experiences over the last handful of years. I guess it's going on 5+ years now. So we'll dive into that. So that's me. I think what's interesting when we say diaspora, I've lived and traveled quite a bit, and I think that's influenced my sensibilities, my understanding of community and place, and my aspirations for Jamaica, the country that I was born and raised before moving to the US. And then in the white down there, some of the organizations that I'm associated with. So I tried to create a visual diagram of the filled in dots are places that I've lived, and the open circles are the places that I've been fortunate enough to spend time or visit, and so on and so forth. One of my most recent life experiences was living in Myanmar, Yangon, for 3 years. This was prior to the military taking over recently, when the country had major aspirations to move towards democracy, and so on and so forth. Jamaica, again, that's where I started, and now I find myself working in Jamaica again as this nation seeks to become a republic. Houston, I've had residency here on and off since 2010. Detroit, that was the port of entry for me when we came from the islands. Chicago, I spent a decade there as a professional. Love that city, miss it quite a bit, miss the architectural community there. Spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong, time in Singapore, study abroad in India, and did get a chance to meet Balkrishna Doshi, who passed away last year. Spent another study abroad in Berlin. And from the art side, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Romare Bearden, Christo, Miro, those are some of the artists that I tend to lean towards because of how they express themselves through color, art, scale. Now, to a specific example of a project that fits within the context we're discussing. Out of many, one people is the motto of the, the country of Jamaica. Um, all of you may have experienced it where typically ethnicity is less of sort of an identifier as nationality. And so Jamaica's motto is, yep, we all are from somewhere else. And there's extreme national pride. I could tell you I've had experiences in Jamaica where, I try to have a conversation about ethnicity. And folks are like, well, I'm Jamaican. What do you want me to do? I'm like, well, that's your nationality, your So it's really ingrained in the culture and people. I won't read all this text, but there's great ambition about what this project at National Heroes Park, this parliament, would represent. Of course, we all know the history of the diaspora, specifically the diaspora in the Caribbean. And many of these nations within CARICOM and within the Caribbean have aspirations relative to where they started and where they want to be. Many are still commonwealths, and many have aspirations of becoming republics. Obviously, to hit that designation, there are things that some of these governments want to achieve economically, infrastructure, credit ratings, the built environment. And so many of these nations are creating their KPIs around what they feel would represent their next step in their evolution. So citing, National Heroes Park was once a major, I don't know where my mouse is, a major horse racing track, where per the Jamaican Constitution and achieving independence from the British, they designated effectively 9 of the 52 acres for a future parliament building. And in the interim, the last 63 years or so, 64 years, 61 years, the sort of the temporary facility, Gordon House, has been where the Jamaican Parliament has governed the nation from. And the building was not a purpose-built building, nor does it have the capacity to support their needs. Again, a very prideful nation. National Heroes Park, the reasoning for that is both prime ministers, governor generals, and national heroes are enshrined within the existing park. I think, the culture that's been exported of what Jamaica is, we understand tourism, we understand sports, track and field, cuisine, and of course, we understand music, Bob Marley, and so on. And these are just components of Jamaica that has managed, as small as the nation is, to actually be a brand that's been exported all over the world. And again, Kingston, where we're working, Kingston is the urban side of the island where most of the tourists are on the north side of the island. But this is where typical life happens. So there's Jamaica in the Caribbean. Here's our site, our 52-acre site, looking south towards the harbor, the sea. Let's see what else I could point out. Looking north towards the mountains. Here's the shrine area, which is used pretty regularly. and then another view from north looking across to where the building should be located at some point in the future. Our approach was to take the largest public space in Kingston and transform it into National Heroes Park. And so that's what this design entailed. There was a multi-stage global competition. We managed to be selected of one of five. We were given feedback after stage one. At the completion of stage two, there was a two-stage selection process. There was a public component where the public could vote on their preferred scheme. And then there was a committee of professionals who selected the team that would go on to design the building. We were lucky to win both at a ceremony in 2019, March 27th, I believe, 2019. There is also a larger commitment from the government. You see the yellow oval, and then you see another line that surrounds that oval. Smith Gill architecture firm in Chicago, they're master planning this entire district. And sort of the center of this district would be the catalyst, which would be this Parliament building and park. That's the airport. This is historic downtown Kingston. And the government's aim is to revitalize downtown Kingston. Site, a couple of things to note. We mentioned 52-acre park, 9 acres for the Parliament area, some information about the building footprint. Less than 5% of the site is where we're putting physical footprint. And we worked really hard to make the park publicly accessible. That was not the initial aim, but we really worked hard to convince the government to keep this a public asset. Over 1,000 trees we're proposing are added to the site. Of course, we're using local and resilient plants, new walkways, improved infrastructure, barrier-free, amenities, enhanced shrine area, secured and safe. And with a massive green space like that in a country that experiences a lot of drought, we were charged with making sure the park was green year-round. Big effort. And fortunately, unfortunately for us, the country adopted IBC 2009 when we started a project. However, none of the authorities were trained yet in 2009. Meanwhile, our entire design team, we were accustomed to IBC 2018. So we work with the local government to bring them along relative to international standards. So National Heroes Park, here's the aim, right? To protect, to honor, to play health, to pay reverence, right? To show culture, duty and pride. And so we had this vision about allowing users to circulate the site, access the site, and programming the site with very flexible spaces. The southern portion of the campus would be more to honor the country's history. The northern portion was the southern portion was to honor, pay reverence. The northern portion, we saw that as a flexible space where citizens could hold their government accountable, from protest to the annual kite flying contest. So we saw those elements. This was an early vision of what that new park space could look like. And then another view from north looking south with the building, with the park, the different program components we had within the space, and sectionally, what that looks like. So again, you might see a faint blue line in this plan. when we originally started, the government intent was to uh, that the entire 52 acres would not be accessible to the public. We thought that was just absolutely the wrong way to go, especially with this theme of equity and justice, that this park belongs to the people. So we work with the government to kind of shrink that fence line to the minimum line they needed for security around the parliament. And of course, that allowed us to program differently. So we have an outdoor amphitheater, um, because of course music is just culturally important in Jamaica, and we wanted the public to be able to utilize this for outdoor events in addition to the leisure spaces for families and such. Um, and this was our vision, that this is an active place. This would be the largest design park space on the island that belongs to the taxpayers. Along that line of justice and equity, the way we got into the project, initially the government was contracting directly with the Chinese government, who would finance, design, and build a building on behalf of the government. However, the Jamaican citizens were sternly against that approach. And so that's when the government changed the model to then pursue this project as a competition and financing the project from their own coffers. So a couple more images of components of the project. Now, the building. Um, Again, the building is there to inspire. The building, as the Prime Minister would say, is there to allow the government to govern. Um, to pay reverence to traditions. Um, and these were all components that were critical. And I think one of the most important things that the government wanted to do was to show its citizens, CARICOM, the Commonwealth, and then the globe, honestly, that Jamaica is moving rapidly into the next century. Their vision for themselves is to be the Singapore of the Caribbean. I don't know if that's a great thing or if that's a challenge. What I do know is that definitely will impact um, its coastal areas. And they will need to pay great attention to this drive to have what everyone else has: infrastructure, roads, a stable power grid. With that, now the country will be very attractive for further development. So these are things they'll have to think through. This is a view from the visitors entry, which is at a lower elevation compared to the government's entry, which is actually on the north side of the building. I won't spend too much time on floor plans, but we structured the design around a circular building, because our view was that there should be no back, no front to this project, especially with the building seated within an oval site. And so that was a major driver for us, relative to, from a siting standpoint, relative planning standpoint. We structured the circulation within the building similar to kind of the street grid that Jamaicans are familiar with. There's a strong boulevard, right? There's a crossroads, and there's a loop, right, that circulates you throughout the site. And while we were drawing and designing, we wanted a very, very clear, very legible drawings that could be understood without us being in the room to explain the drawings. And I think we did a pretty good job at that. And of course, as part of the program, there are two main spaces: the Senate and the House debate chambers. And those two spaces needed to dialogue between the two. very large spaces, which took quite a bit of coordination. Of course, we had gardens, interior gardens within the space to introduce nature, natural light within the spaces. Um, the exterior, and I'll wrap up on the exterior here. Um, you notice the building is kind of wrapped in these crossing columns. The initial driver, there are many, but I literally read the Jamaican Constitution. Uh, and fortunately, I did, because in many of the meetings with the Jamaican government, I was able to use that to push back against some of um, their ideas that weren't community centric, right? Uh, because I was able to point out their constitution says something different. And what their constitution is very clear is that um, the relationship between its citizens, its voters, and their elected representatives is the foundation of their government. And so, we created these X columns to represent that relationship. And again, designing for competitions, and designing for public competitions, we consider memory and what people may remember. And sort of these X columns represented that connection between government and its citizens. Uh, this country has been plagued with hurricanes and earthquakes. Our design represented resilience and strength for a lot of the voters and a lot of the government members, where some of the other designs were glass boxes, and that actually evoked fear for many of its citizens. So our design was well received. For us, we wanted that relationship or that expression of the X columns to actually be a spatial condition, which creates an arcade around the building. It serves many purposes, from leisure for meeting spaces to, in effect, a modern brise soleil. And as an icon, as an image that could be used on a lot of the country's branding material. And so here's some early expressions of what that space could feel like, right? And mind you, it's a round building, the site is round, so it's very dynamic. And we did many studies about the quality of that space and the materiality of that space. And we chose precast because we also, within equity and justice, we have to think through the local labor population, right? And if we did a steel building, that would limit who could participate in the construction of this building. And so we went with concrete for the superstructure, and precast, which could actually be, there were several precasters on the island. More imagery about the quality of that enclosure. Working both in the States and in Jamaica, meeting with engineers and architects in the island about how we would go about creating these X columns. And the X columns actually binded the team together. There are 72 of those X columns. We created a matrix to assist in designing and communicating the work. And this is the quality of the X columns and the enclosure section through the building. What else do we have here? And there you have it. This is the Jamaican Parliament and National Heroes Park, which in the question and answers, I'm happy to expound more about why this was emotional. You could only imagine, my family came to the US, one, primarily so I could have a different education and to study architecture, and with the team win the commission to design the Parliament building in the country I was born and raised. It's a big honor, a very big honor. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Daimian. Yeah, I'm very excited to get into the question and answer. And I have to say to everyone, I've sat with Daimian on a previous panel and got to preview some of this work and content behind the project. And the depth is just remarkable. As a fellow Caribbean citizen as well, but also being able to engage in this dialogue within this common field that we practice. So very much looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Daimian. Really appreciate that. We'll go ahead and get into our respondent portion of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Stefan. So Stefan is currently a doctoral candidate at TU Delft in the Netherlands, where his research centers on the impact of immigration on contemporary urban transformation. He holds a professional degree in architecture from Universidad Central de Venezuela and a master's in architecture from Harvard University. He is an assistant professor of design at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism at UCB. He is also a co-director of Incursiones, a nonprofit design platform working on public space projects, installations, and education programs. The firm's work has been nominated for the Mies Krong Hall Americas Prize and selected as a finalist for the 12th Ibero-American Biennale of Architecture, and presented at the London Festival of Architecture, Deutsche Architektenmuseum, Bartlett School of Architecture, and the 12th Rotterdam Biennale, among others. With that, I'd like to present Stefan. So whenever you're ready, Stefan, thank you. Thank you again for your participation.
Thank you, Anisha, for your introduction. Thank you all for being here, to also Irene and Fabio for organizing this, and thank you, Daimian, for your presentation of your fantastic project. I think something that I liked about the setup was the kind of open-endedness of it around the kind of keywords or words that were very evocative. Certainly the word emotional is also part of the research that I'm doing, also the diaspora and diasporic knowledge. So what I wanted to share with you as a way of trying to maybe create some kind of common ground and then carry the conversation forward is a project that I'm working on right now, which is not a design project. It is a research project, and it has to do with part of my PhD research. I will go ahead and share my screen and start that way, and also keep an eye on the time. Please let me know if there's any issues with the screen sharing. Okay. So I titled this, it's always a kind of variation of the research title. It has to do with architecture and caretaking and relation with the changes that the city is undergoing as a consequence of immigration and collapse, which are two situations or two parts of the crisis that are integrally kind of or very deeply interwoven. As you may know, Venezuela has been going for the last few decades through a complex crisis that has political, economic, and social components. And over the last decade, this situation has, the crisis has accelerated, and this has created a massive migratory crisis. The Venezuelan migratory crisis is currently the largest in the world. It has surpassed Syria and Ukraine, which are both war-torn countries, and it has become certainly a Caribbean and a continental problem, and a phenomenon that is kind of changing the way that Venezuela conceives of itself, from a country that has been historically a receptor of immigration to a country that produces migration. The migratory crisis has affected the population pyramid, has reshaped the population pyramid, And since the majority of migrants are the productive segment of the population, that is people between 15 and 49 years of age, this has left a great amount of mainly children and elderly behind, and oftentimes caring for one another. Immigration started over a decade ago. I mean, massive immigration started as typically a phenomenon of middle class and professional segment of the population. But as the situation or the crisis became worse, it became a cross-sectional phenomenon that is now cutting across all segments of the population, and it's also territorially expanded as well. There are no official estimates about the impact of the population in terms of the vacancy that it has created. However, informal informal surveys carried out by local municipal authorities in different parts of the city estimate that around 50% of buildings and houses in some parts of Caracas are vacant. And that is a number that is hard to come to terms with, and that's why also I wanted to include this photograph that is a kind of broad view of the city, and I would like to kind of, as a way to let this idea sink in, think of the cities where you are, where you're from, where you live, and imagine 50% of buildings and houses just being empty. So in this context, my research is focused not on the most visible and the most maybe dramatic side of the migratory crisis, which is the impact of migrants in destination countries and cities, but on the other side of the process, because there is no immigration without emigration. So I'm looking at the problem of what immigration leaves behind. The Venezuelan migratory crisis has a singularity which sets it apart from other cases. You can see, for example, an image that may be familiar to you, which is Detroit, in which massive or immigration also kind of was entangled with economic decline, and it resulted in a specific kind of abandonment where people just kind of renounced the rights of property and kind of walked away from property. This was one specific form of vacancy, and there's also the case of post-socialist countries in Eastern Europe where the state owned property and people also walked away, and this created a different problem. And the singularity of the situation in Venezuela, and certainly in Caracas, is that for a large segment of the population, immigration has not been accompanied by giving up rights over property, but migrants actually retain their property after having left the country. And so this decision to leave and at the same time retain property has set in motion a series of practices and spatial transformations around preserving property and around preserving domestic spaces and around preserving memory and a whole lot of ideas and a whole lot of emotions that come with that. So what I would like to do very briefly, my research typically produces writing. So what I would like to share with you is something that I've been working on, which are kind of extracts of episodes, which is kind of a device that I am working on to structure my research. So I want to read to you very briefly from 3 different episodes. The first one is called Material Accumulation. In Caracas, the material accumulation amassed by departure comes in the forms of houses, apartments, cars, furniture, books, artwork, objects, as well as plants and pets. It is an accumulation in the sense of sheer quantity, expressed in thousands of houses, tens of thousands of cars, and millions of objects. It is also an accumulation in the form that these objects take, as rows of houses, as piles of books, and as heaps of chairs, tables, bed frames, cupboards stacked with dishes and glasses, as closets full of clothes, and as boxes filled with every imaginable object. Also, it is an accumulation in the sense of an obstruction of things whose life cycle was suddenly interrupted. However, this interruption was not a suspension of matter in time. Rather, it has opened material residues to new life cycles that demand attention and create possibilities, which occur along 2 interconnected paths. First, matter circulates through a niche economy of second-hand markets, garage sales, online chats, and scavengers who buy scrap metal or used books by weight to melt or turn into pulp. Second, matter decays, setting in motion practices that revolve around preserving and extending life by maintaining, repairing, and using objects and spaces. Material residues have another dimension in the form of the livelihoods and the anecdotes that are interwoven with them. In Caracas, everyone has a friend, a sibling, or a parent who has migrated. Departure is also the backdrop of stories of vacant houses, illegal invasions, apartments taken over by birds, neighbors who survive by selling their family's possessions, of personal libraries lost to mold, and plants left over to friends. Many of the practices that have emerged around departure are shrouded in secrecy and opacity. Spaces and stories become available only after the protective layer that shields practices are peeled away. In this sense, material accumulation, however large, remains mostly invisible. It belongs to the realm of the private and the interior, hidden from view and absent from the city. Modes of departure. Here, we can see fallen avocados scattered around, uneaten. Lettuce leaves and a plastic dish filled with water lie by the gate. Aloe plants and dracaenas hint at a lush but unkempt garden, preserved by its contact with the soil, rather than by human action. In the back, a broken-down car is half shielded from view in a poor effort to protect it from the sun. The curtains are drawn, blocking the view inside the house. Once a domestic garden, the intermediate space between the house and the street has become a full-scale terrarium, an encased ecosystem where various life forms sustain each other without external input, that is, except for the tortoises. This family left their tortoises behind. Now the neighbors feed them through the gate. That is how a local resident explained it to me, as she pointed at the animals. Tortoises are a common pet in Caracas. Here, in this vacant house, they're contained in a space that is visible and partially accessible, from where they cannot be removed, but where they can be collectively sustained. This operation displaces the care from the house to the animals. As neighbors feed the animals, they guarantee the endurance of the habitat that supports them, and by extension, the house behind them. Many houses are vacant, others are partially inhabited. My tour guide explained it to me. A topographer used to live here. That is why he had that large truck. This house belonged to an airline pilot, but he passed away. This is the house of a Venezuelan opposition leader in exile. I don't know who looks after this place. These people have a relative who lives nearby. She comes every now and then to check on the place. Vacant spaces are sites of mourning and attachment, but also creativity. They're irreducible just to failed material or ruins, and they operate instead as, quote, places of extinction and death on one hand, and as creative potential and the possibility for change on the other, in the Benjaminian sense. The collector. Bookshelves are stacked from floor to ceiling in a narrow corridor. At the back, a partial view of a window with trees from a garden beyond. The floor is poured white granite in a rhomboid pattern, and with the garden, the only traces of a previous domesticity. In this house, materiality and spatial structure remain intact, but the space has been radically reprogrammed. The main level contains a second-hand bookstore with more than 100,000 volumes. In the upper floor, bedrooms have been turned into co-working spaces. The income produced by these operations sustain the project that has taken form in the basement, where a humidity and light-controlled room contains hundreds of rare volumes, manuscripts, first editions, and antique books. The Venezuelan Book Museum is neither a private nor a public collection. It falls in the ambiguous territory of individual enterprises taking over functions that correspond to the state. When I visited the house, Ignacio Alvarado, the museum's founder, was walking in with a stack of books. An elderly neighbor had recently passed, and he was asked to visit and take whatever he found of value. As he explained, "This is part of my routine. I visit one or two houses a week. I have become incredibly selective and only rescue books for the museum now. Thousands of books are being lost." In his essay about collecting, Walter Benjamin is concerned with two aspects. First, collecting as an action that turns the collection into a record of places that were visited or of previous ownership. But Benjamin is also preoccupied with what the collection makes possible, with how fragments brought together by a mix of intention and luck constitute a means to renew old worlds. The collection then operates as an assembly, transcending the personal realm and entering that of cultural preservation. So this book museum is an index of extinction. For its collection to grow, other collections must disappear. In this operation, disassembly and assembly are not symmetrical, but include a range of collateral processes, discard, decay, recycle, in which parts of an old world are lost while others are preserved as memory. As I visited empty houses and apartments in Caracas, books were a recurrent feature. In some cases, libraries were locked away and made up makeshift deposits inside the houses and apartments. In other cases, books were left on display for tenants to use or to extend the owner's presence. Inevitably, vacant shelves invoked a sense of finality to departure. Walter Benjamin suggested that pursuing books also reveals something of the city that contains them. If that is so, tracing books in Caracas reconstructs the routines of departure. The preservation of books and their destruction is a mirror image of the city that is at the juncture of extinction and possibility. And as a way to conclude, I wanted to share a brief reflection. In Caracas, as I was exposed every day to these left-behind homes and the accumulation of every imaginable object that they contained, I was haunted by a recurrent question: what will happen to all these things? This question, which is impossible to answer, exposes a link between the fate of the matter and the fate of the country, the first as a kind of mirror image of the latter. And as such, answering the question requires picturing various scenarios. In one scenario, the country makes it, and so do these things. Migrants return, boxes are reopened, pictures are hung back on walls, and books are returned to shelves. This association is at the center of nostalgia, fueling fantasies of restoring an ideal past and its projection into the future, as if it was possible to bypass the present. The other scenario requires accepting the impossibility of answering the question and engaging with the meanwhileness of collapse. Meanwhileness is not a suspension of time, but a lack of synchronization and an overlap of a myriad of individual efforts and multiple temporalities, as well as a concern for the provisional and the tentative over the long-term and the certain. This path opens the material accumulation produced by immigration to speculation. It has already found a fertile ground in art, in literature, and in film. However, it has been absent in architectural and urban research, since our disciplines are stuck in treating collapse as a problem to solve. Overcoming this storyline requires a new imaginary that creatively incorporates vacancy and departure in the construction of a collective future. So I would like to propose that somewhere between fiction and policy lies a path forward for approaching and reimagining material residues and the emerging world of collapse, a path that can be forged by a sense of productive mourning that avoids both nostalgia and cynicism. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much.
Again, just what exciting content. And I get to a point where I start writing and then I need to write more because the thoughts keep, come in as I think about the content that has been presented, and particularly with these two presentations, the juxtaposition of thinking about the idea of migration. So at this point, let me just preface that I will pose a question to Daimian and Stefan individually, but I really want to encourage your dialogue between each other, because on one hand, where we saw Daimian talk about this process or act of going back home, right, going back to Jamaica to do the service, this architectural service that has not only a resonance with producing an architectural product, but being home having a particular connection, right, to home. And with Stefan, you're sort of showing the opposite side of it, sort of what sort of remnants are left in terms of leaving home, and how architecture has a certain sort of presence, a left behind presence with these movements, these extracts that you presented. And I'm just really interested in that juxtaposition. So I'll launch into my first question. I'll let you guys get more into the juxtaposition, but I wanted to start with something from Daimian. You mentioned reading, as part of your design process, reading the Constitution. I remember the first time I heard you say that in another conversation, and I was just so intrigued by, what did you discover, or what was something really unique in what you discovered in the Constitution of Jamaica that really acted as a guide, a compass, something that allowed you to sort of keep what the original expressed intent of what this project could be, as you thought about the relationship between the government and its citizens, as you thought about revitalizing this part of Kingston. So can you just summarize if there was, anything specific that really sort of centered your design team in that aspect?
Yeah, I'm going to freestyle a bit, but, and this is 2019 when I was, just buried in doing the work, that I read every word with just this ferocious energy. Because as I read, I saw the ambitions of, the founding fathers of the nation, where it was written in such a way to protect the integrity of governance, and it simultaneously protect the integrity of its citizens participating in the process of governance. And what stood out was, oh gosh, we're being recorded, but I don't think I'll say this. What stood out was there were some moments where there were some headwinds, where what we were being asked to do as design professionals did not prioritize the ambitions of the citizens, right? I'll say those things were, we were being asked to prioritize these things because of just time, right? Security, right? And so we take one that, we need a space that's secure. There's risk in having a certain level of public accessibility to the space. And this is human nature and just safety. But some of those requests were contrary to terms within the Constitution, right? So we are there reading terms in the Constitution that says, well, a meeting has to take place within so many feet of the fence line of the building, and that defines the security boundary, right? So we had to learn that up so we could say to the government that, no, well, you want this entire park to not be accessible, but per the terms of your Constitution, it says, there's 150 feet from where the meeting is happening, Parliament is happening, to where you define the secure line, right? And we were able to say, here it is in your Constitution, which means in lieu of pushing the fence line to the curb, now you could actually move the fence line, we're talking lots of meters. Now we're going from none of the park is accessible, or say 20% of the park is accessible, to now 80% of the park is accessible, right? And I think that took the project from being a Parliament campus to a national park that contains a government building. And that became a paradigm shift in how we thought through the project. So just one of those nuanced things where it was hard reading, but I'm glad we read it because it empowered us to enter a conversation that had real implications about spatial justice, right? Real implication, like, 40 acres worth of implication. And so that's my story on the Constitution.
Thank you, Daimian. And to Stefan, I'll actually just sort of quote something again mentioned in Daimian's presentation, where he talked about the entry sequences to the building. He mentioned no front, no back. And you also mentioned the Venezuelan Book Museum. I just love that there was an individual that was committed to ensuring that, the books that needed to be preserved were in fact being preserved, and you described it as it was neither public nor private. So in terms of the extracts that you presented, so the material accumulation, modes of departure, the collector, in thinking about the role of architecture or what's left behind in terms of architecture after, events such as migration, how do you see in a future thinking, how could architecture sort of, intervene? You mentioned this sort of space between fiction and policy. Does spatial justice really start to try to mend either sides of those, perspectives of thinking about what's left behind in terms of architecture?
Yeah, I would like to think so, in the sense that what vacancy does, I mean, vacancy, the easiest way to understand it is just a kind of absence of use in terms of whatever a space or a building was originally intended to be used for. So what it does is that it creates also a kind of space of possibility, and we've seen this in the city in many ways, where decay and decline in public space, and in a context where there is an enormous kind of lack for basic infrastructure, vacancy and creates a kind of platform for things to happen. And what is very curious is that these things happen without the participation of architects. They happen kind of on the periphery of our kind of professional or disciplinary attention. So I would like to think that part of the task for us or for this project is to kind of recenter our attention in those possibilities that are already taking place in many cases.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'd like to, give you and Daimian the opportunity, if you have any questions for each other or comments that you'd like to pose while I, prep the rest of the audience to,
For sure.
To present any questions you may have in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the Zoom function. We're moving into that segment where I can open it up to the audience now to have further conversation.
One note I'd like to make, and I think Anisia, you brought it up, it's right between the two presentations, this undertone maybe of departure, arrival, maybe exporting, importing, migration, immigration. And we're talking, and I felt I was talking with a certain level of optimism, because Stefan, you also mentioned Detroit, and I remember 2008, 2009, my friends from Detroit who were in, New York or LA or Chicago, many were like, okay, I know what's happening with this departure in Detroit because we all left, but many were returning mid-crisis, post-crisis to actually grow the economy and take advantage of the opportunities in Detroit. I wasn't one of them, but in participating in the Jamaican Parliament, I also witnessed that there's this keen interest, less more about opportunity, but uh, the the Jamaican expats in the diaspora, many endeavor to return, right? And I also had to read another document when a couple in Miami asked us to design a beachfront a home in Jamaica. And they're like, okay, here's the list of things that per the government taxation standards we're exempt from, and we could bring back into the country, right? From things you would think about, generators and solar panels, but there's this incentive to where the government accepted that people would leave, right? And also accepted the fact that its citizens would return. So did you find any research where there's that kind of dynamic, where there's an acceptance of the departure and sort of a expectation of a return?
Yes.
A local shifting in the usage of space.
I've found it not. I think what you're describing fits very well with the kind of migratory and circular migration dynamics that one sees in the peripheries of the European Union, with the European Union, where people move back and forth. And also, I think that there's also a very interesting example that might be a lot closer to all of you culturally and geographically, which is the relationship between Mexico, rural Mexico, and the southern part of the United States, Arizona, California, Texas, etc., and the impact that immigration has had in the culture and the building culture and the social traditions and even the building industry in rural Mexico. I think those dynamics are much more visible in other places than what I've seen back at home. I think also because of the fact that the migration in Venezuela is still a relatively recent phenomenon. This in a massive scale, the way it has happened in the last decade is still a recent phenomenon. That it's still, and it's also very volatile in terms of coming and going. But yeah, I mean, maybe I can tie this to your question, and also to kind of to Anisha's previous comment about leaving home, and also maybe your experience has been something similar, in the sense that you leave and you go back, you leave and you go back. So this idea that migration is, a kind of linear trajectory from A to B and that's it, is challenged in so many ways in the present, and what comes out of that in the end is something that is a lot more kind of effervescent and productive in terms of culture and multiculturalism and knowledge in many ways. I mean, then my question to you would be, maybe as an architect who also had this experience of growing up in a place, going away, coming back, growing out, this kind of back and forth diasporic relation to your home country. What do you think that your kind of contribution is, or from this position, in a sense?
The ad for me, and again, this is what my parents told me, that the economy in Jamaica limited opportunities, right? And my main driver in revisiting, right, and returning is what contributions, right? How can I contribute to realizing sort of those desires on the island, or do they exist? And this is just a natural pattern, because, you know, I left as a child, and my early return visits to Jamaica was that of a tourist and visiting family. As a professional, my experience in Kingston, Jamaica was working with professionals on the island. And I quickly realized that those things that are abroad are actually here. What I think was maybe clear is it's all contingent on economics, your access to education. And so there are these socioeconomic drivers that could impact the migration pattern. And obviously there's the, you know, issues of stability. Again, I mentioned I was in Myanmar, and the only reason I was in Yangon was after some 60 years of military rule, that control was relinquished to a semi-quasi democratic government. And there was a swift move to expand that. And I was able, and Nico Steerley's on this call, she joined me there, where we did nation building projects, and we brought Burmese from across the Burmese diaspora back to Myanmar to help build their country. And so there are all these different drivers, you know, and for me, while I was there, I'm witnessing Burmese coming back home to build their country. And I jumped on that opportunity when in 2018-19, there was that opportunity to do the same in Jamaica. So I'll just share that as a connection.
Thank you, Daimian and Stefan. Audience, can I open it up to you? Irene, it looks like you're ready to jump in.
I have so many questions. I was just trying to double check a title. Yeah, thank you both so much. And I think it's really interesting, this pairing, right? Because there's a tension and a struggle in these narratives of development and literal nation building and in the parliamentary building, and then collapse. And so I'm sitting here trying to really think about how maybe taking a global perspective on the overdevelopment of some places and the underdevelopment of other places. And the Caribbean has been, you know, often a site of underdevelopment to enrich other sites. That feels like the tie. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to bring this into a question. I guess I'm wondering how you might think about this. Like, I flagged something while you were speaking, Daimian, about the government's interest in becoming the Singapore of the Caribbean, that you put the caution on. And so I'm kind of wondering if maybe you could reflect on, both of you, on Jamaica and Venezuela and discourses of development, but also I've been thinking a lot about what is that there really is not sustainable growth, right? That what we need to be looking for right now are forms of stability, of good life, of buen vivir, the South American kind of idea of how can we build societies that sustain people where they are, allow people to come home. And yeah, so maybe from these two positions of optimistic development and pessimistic collapse, do you have any thoughts on where the movement might be towards equilibrium?
I like to run my mouth, so I'm letting Stefan respond first.
It's yeah. I mean, it's a difficult question because and it's one that I have encountered several times as I come across literature that I'm reading for my research, which take a kind of negative view on progress and a critical view on progress, which sometimes comes from positions of incredible, but yet kind of unacknowledged privilege, in the sense that I mean, you know, disregarding progress. I think that in the context of, you know, global development, and considering, you know, the many millions of billions of people who have a kind of expectation of seeing their life conditions improved through I can't think of another word, but development. I mean, having access to education, health, vaccines, better food. I really don't know where the balance is. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I mean, I think that I would like to think that we are learning from mistakes, but maybe I'm being naive.
Yeah, and you know, responsible growth. It feels, from my experience, you know, challenge for nations, right? So I'll speak on Jamaica. The government's big driver is to employ its population, and not just with entry-level jobs, but training for skilled positions, so that they could actually reduce the amount of its citizens leaving for opportunities. You know, but then what does Jamaica have to offer? So Jamaica's economy is tourism. And so the government has put an emphasis in completing a highway that circles the entire island, right? To which then the private sector comes in and brings in more hotels, construction jobs are created, so on and so forth. But a couple weeks ago, I was talking to our landscape architect who's there, and she's been practicing for some 40 years there. And she said, we're losing our coastline, right? We're losing this. And she was like, it's been so beautiful and untouched for so many years. But at the same time, she said, you know, I've grown my business and I've employed, you know, many more people now, because with these projects brings opportunity. And she was very torn about sort of the give and take in this move to offer Jamaicans what I think people across the world want, a means to support their family, you know, gainful employment. And for Jamaica, the economy is tourism. I think they have heard the note about what is responsible growth. So as much kilometers of road they're laying an equal amount of fiber optic cables, because a large percentage, and I think there's some 75,000 Jamaicans who are working remotely via the internet for companies across the globe. And that's just expanding. And those are well-paying jobs, right? So I think they're trying to balance that. What balance looks like, I'm not a judge. I think, you know, I've seen some of the country's sort of policies relative to the environment, relative to job growth, relative to development. Is it balance? I'm not sure what that means.
Thank you, Daimian and Stefan. Irene, thank you for that question. And I know we'll have even more continued dialogue around that. Is there anyone else in the audience that'd like to ask a question or comment? We're right at the end time, but I want to just give just a couple extra minutes to give you that opportunity, and our wrap up will be really brief. So, anyone else? Any other thoughts? Doesn't have to be a question, could also be a comment as well.
Anicia mentioned a concept, and it's on the website for the lab, Afrofuturism. And initially I had to research the concept. And I think we sat on a panel where I wanted to modify the concept, or, the concept is this, and correct me if I'm wrong, the concept is about poetry, art, music that positions Africans and Africans in the diaspora in a futuristic context where their participation is greater than it actually historically has been. So, for example, the example I use is the movie Black Panther, right? There's this, African community that has all the advanced technology, all the cures for everything you can imagine. And that to me was like kind of this example of Afrofuturism. And while we were on this panel chatting, being involved in projects that cover are within the diaspora that have an impact to Africans in the diaspora, African Americans, Caribbean Africans, so on and so forth. I posited a position that, okay, Afrofuturism applies to this architectural work as well, and giving folks a voice and creating this future where Africans and diaspora actually play a greater role. So, Anicia, just thanks for, bringing that concept to my attention. And I've been trying to consume as much information as I can to talk in a more, thoughtful way about the idea. But it's an idea that's rich. And I think we're in a movement now, and I've told you about some of the stuff I'm working on, that I look forward to what 10 years from now looks like.
Mm-hmm. Daimian, thank you for bringing that up again. And as I've been diving more into that part of my research and, being involved, being a part of the building team with the Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab, I, start to even sift that even more into looking at specific regions. So there's, I'm looking at authors who talk about Caribbean, the specifically Caribbean perspective on Afrofuturism. So it's been really exciting to think about that. And yes, you did recall it exactly as we were talking about, and really just the intersection. So authors like Yatasha Womack, Ingrid Lafleur, they talk about the intersection of the use of technology, right? Understanding ideas of liberation, which we saw sort of culminate in the Black Panther movie. So thanks for bringing that back to recollection here. And when I think about the idea of technology, sometimes we think technology exists purely in this digital realm, but I think about something you said in your presentation, just the very act of considering what materials you would use, right? When we think about material technology, that would be considered in a way that you could bring the Jamaican labor force into this project, right? Really considering what is possible in terms of building back there. And that was also an act of reinvesting into the community. So it's these, facets of design that we engage in every day on every project. But I think we also have to consider how in a sort of justified way, it contributes wholly to the specific, project and the people we're designing for, which is why I enjoy the series. I enjoy this lab. I wish we could keep chatting forever. So, all right. If there aren't any questions, I'd like to first go ahead and thank Stefan and Daimian for just your remarkable presentations today. The reflection will be endless, at least I know for me. We really, really appreciated your perspectives that you presented today. I really enjoy when we could sort of look at, these juxtaposed positions and be able to sort of talk in the interstitial spaces and around those positions. So thank you both very, very much. Audience, I really appreciate you being on the call with us today. I want to say thank you to Irene and Fabio. We love this Caribbean connection that, we have and discovered, 3 years ago, landed at LSU. So thank you all for, collectively helping to bring these sessions together. With that, we have one more session, and I'll just pull up the reminder here really quickly. So it's our last colloquium session in this series. We hope to bring more of this content in the future. So it's scheduled for April 26th, same time, 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Time. Professor Michael Lipoy will be presenting. He is from OCADU, but also a fellow Trinidad and Tobagonian from where I'm from, and also is teaching and working in Canada. So we're really looking forward to that presentation as well. And as I mentioned, also looking forward to continuing this conversation. We're not sure yet what that might look like, but I assure you there may be more series coming your way from the Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab. So before I end, Irene, Fabio, is there anything you'd like to add? Are we good on wrapping up? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you for the next session and other conversations we might have in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.